Yesterday, we talked about life in the universe, life on K2-18b. Will there be life? Will there not be life with the great discovery from the James Webb Space Telescope? And today we're going to talk about life again on Mars. Look at Mars. Remember I talked a whole lot about Mars with you, right? Very well. Drillings made by NASA's Curiosity rover have discovered the long-awaited, so famous, so sought-after, how should we say, simulated carbon cycle on Mars. Do you know what the conclusion is? Mars was habitable in the past. Let's understand this whole story. There came a moment when NASA decided to create the Follow the Water plan. That's right, meaning to follow the water. That's why all the rovers came, right? Spirit, Opportunity, Curiosity, Perseverance. All of them came along this new line of research, which was to follow the water. Very well. So, we already knew, it had been discovered and all, that the red planet once had liquid water, that it had a thicker atmosphere in the past. We already had all of this in mind. If it had liquid water in the past, does that mean Mars had life? Did life exist on Mars? Was Mars habitable? Did Mars have a condition for life to develop in the past? And a very fundamental piece of the puzzle was missing for all of this. A piece called the carbon cycle was missing. The carbon cycle, for those who don't know, is perhaps one of the most important cycles we have on planet Earth. In fact, life here on Earth only exists this way thanks to the carbon cycle. Did Mars have this carbon cycle? How will we find that out? To find out, we have to prove that Mars had a specific type of rock, which are carbonate rocks. Until then, we didn't have proof, 100% conclusive evidence. Remember the 5 sigma confidence level? That's right, we didn't have that, but everything changed now with it, with NASA's Curiosity rover. All the climate models that were made of Mars, studying the planet, show that Mars needed to have had a CO2-rich atmosphere to keep liquid water on its surface. Why? Because Mars has a very low atmospheric pressure, a very low temperature. In these conditions, water is not stable in a liquid state on the surface, for it to have remained liquid. And how do we know it did? Because there were rivers. We already know about rivers that float on Mars. It needed to have a thick CO2 atmosphere. That is the big question. The CO2 should have interacted with the planet's basaltic rocks, created by volcanoes, and formed minerals, the famous carbonates, as we call them. The problem is that rovers, satellites, and everything else could not find a significant amount of these carbonates on the surface. It was as if the carbon on Mars had simply disappeared. So, one thing was contradicting the other. While we saw water in a liquid state, and to have water, you needed CO2. To have CO2, you needed the carbon cycle. But where are the carbonates? Where did all of this go? Very well. Curiosity is there on Mars and has helped answer all of this. Curiosity, for those who don't know, drills into the Martian soil and collects that powder. I've told you this 1,000 times, right? It takes that little bit of powder, like when you drill a wall, and instead of taking what's inside the wall, you take the powder that falls out. So, in 2023, Curiosity drilled a site called Obajara, which is in Gale Crater, the crater it is studying. And by analyzing these rocks, researchers discovered what they have been searching for decades, siderite, which is an iron carbonate mineral. But it wasn't just there. 3 other drilling sites also revealed the presence of siderite within the layers, and it wasn't a small amount. The samples contained between 5% and 10% siderite, which is a lot for this type of mineral to be found in a rock. So, the Curiosity rover managed to do this. And what's most incredible is that this discovery may have solved the great mystery of the missing carbon, because the siderite was hidden in layers of sulfate, which are abundant on Mars. If other sulfate-rich areas also contain carbonates, this would explain where all the CO2 went. And what else would this explain? It would explain the carbon cycle on Mars. Look how cool that is. For those who have no idea what the carbon cycle is, it's this. On Earth, carbon constantly circulates between the atmosphere, the oceans, the soil, and us, living beings. Volcanoes release CO2. Plants absorb CO2 during photosynthesis. Animals breathe and release CO2. Rocks absorb CO2 and eventually return it to the atmosphere. In other words, this is a dynamic, balanced cycle that has been maintained for millions of years. On Mars, things were a bit different. The rocks on the surface absorbed much more carbon than they released. So, the CO2 went down but never came back up. The analyses showed that the rocks also contained different amount of iron oxyhydroxides, for example, which form when siderite dissolves in acidic water. We already know Mars had acidic water. Opportunity showed us that. So it's all fitting together. This means that the carbon would have returned to the atmosphere. And that's what started this cycle. What happened to Mars is that at some point there was an imbalance, where much more carbon ended up being sequestered in the rocks than was released into the atmosphere. And with this imbalance, the atmosphere's density began to decrease. It became thinner. As the atmosphere thinned, the water disappeared. And then Mars went through this whole big problem it has today. And so we come to the big question of all this, right?
A gente a entender pouco disso. Muito bem. E aí vem, então, a grande questão de tudo isso, né? Qual que é a importância de ter descoberto?
What is the importance of having discovered the carbon cycle? The first big thing is this. The researcher said, Mars was habitable in the past. The presence of siderite shows that Mars really did have a CO2-rich atmosphere and liquid water on its surface. If it had CO2 and liquid water on the surface, this guarantees that the planet was habitable and that all the models made so far about Mars's habitability were absolutely correct. Look how cool that is. But it also shows that Mars, at some point, ceased to be habitable. And that's what scientists are struggling with today, trying to understand what happened to planet Mars that made it no longer habitable. Future missions, obviously, will be able to analyze other areas. And what do you do then? You already know that this siderite is mixed in with sulfate. So, from space with satellites, you can detect where the sulfate is. Where there's sulfate, there's probably siderite. So you land a rover there, and it will probably find the siderite. And then you will study it, and with that, people will get a much more interesting picture. So there you have it, the Curiosity rover making a great discovery. What did it basically discover? It discovered siderite in the middle of sulfates. This proves to us that Mars had a lot of CO2 in its atmosphere. If it had a lot of CO2 in its atmosphere and had liquid water, it had what we call the carbon cycle. If it had the carbon cycle, Mars was habitable. That is the main conclusion. And now, the other major conclusion we hope to reach one day, which is the same as for K2-18b, is being habitable is one thing, having life is another. Did Mars have life? That's what Curiosity's companion, our dear Perseverance, will try to prove. Everything is fitting together in the Martian story. So, did Mars have life or not? Is Mars our next destination? The story of Mars is very cool for those who follow it, and it's this: things are discovered as time goes by, obviously because technology improves. So first you discovered that Mars had dry riverbeds. Great. Did Mars have running water? Then the Follow the Water plan was created, and Spirit and Opportunity landed there. They showed that yes, Mars had water that flowed. It had rivers on its surface because of the round, smooth rocks in the riverbeds. But the water that Opportunity and Spirit found was not good water. It was acidic water. Well, we need to find the so-called good water for life. So they sent Curiosity there for that. Curiosity has been there since 2012 trying to find this evidence. If Mars had the possibility for life to exist, if Mars had everything necessary for life to exist, and it keeps proving it, within 3 months of studying Mars, Curiosity had already discovered that there was good water, not that acidic water. Then it discovered the veins. Then it kept discovering that the bottom of Gale Crater could have been a lake. And so it goes with every passing moment. It discovers another piece of the puzzle. Understanding the planet Mars, especially a question of whether it had life or not, is a huge puzzle, and you keep fitting these pieces together. And there is Curiosity, showing us another great piece of evidence. In fact, For first time in history, we are proving that Mars did have the famous, long-awaited, highly anticipated, and much simulated carbon cycle. And yes, Mars was habitable in the past.